She fell into a human's trap and feared he'd devour her in the worst way. Jack walked through the trees with cold wind on his face and hunger in his belly. His boots pressed softly on the mossy ground, and his eyes stayed sharp. He was the only human left on this part of the alien world, and food was not easy to find. He checked the old rope trap he had tied the night before, hoping something had walked into it, maybe a small beast or bird. But what he found made him freeze. The trap had been triggered, the rope pulled tight, and something was caught in it. Something alive and moving, something not like anything he had seen before. He moved closer, slow and careful, and then he saw her. It was a girl with pale silver skin, long dark hair, and glowing blue lines on her arms. Her clothes were thin and torn, and her hands were tied behind her back by the trap rope. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror, her body shaking like a leaf in wind. She tried to speak, but her words were strange, sharp and quick, not human language. Jack raised both hands to show he meant no harm, but she flinched and tried to pull away. The rope burned her skin as she struggled, and a soft cry left her lips. It sounded like pain and fear and something deep and broken inside. She was not a wild animal, and not just an alien girl. She was scared and alone, and thought he was going to hurt her. He stepped back and opened his bag, showing her a small water bottle. He set it down slowly near her, then walked away to give her space, but she did not move. Her eyes stayed locked on him, full of fear. Her legs were scratched and dirty, and one ankle was swollen like it had been twisted. Jack knew he had to help her, but she did not trust him, and maybe she never would. He looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were forming, and night was coming fast. If he left her there, she would freeze or be found by something worse. He had seen strange shapes in the sky before, ships with lights that searched the ground, like they were looking for someone or something. Maybe this girl was what they were after. Jack cut the rope with his knife, and she dropped to the ground with a soft cry. He held out his hand, but she backed away, crawling into the thick grass like a scared animal. Her breathing was fast, and her chest moved like a drum. In panic, he did not chase her. He just sat down on a rock and opened a small pack of dried meat, chewing slowly, watching her from a safe distance. She watched him to her eyes, never leaving his hands. When he took a bite of food, she blinked. When he drank water, she looked down at the bottle he had left near her. She crawled closer, inch by inch, and touched it with her fingers, then pulled it back fast, like it might burn her. He nodded once and turned away, letting her think he was not watching. A soft sound came from behind him. The bottle had moved, and when he turned again, it was empty. The girl sat with it in her lap, her lips wet from drinking, her hands shaking as she tried to stay still, her eyes still full of fear, but now mixed with something else, confusion maybe, or a little bit of hope. Jack stood slowly and pointed toward his camp, a small tent and fire pit hidden between stones and trees. She did not answer, but she looked at the sky and then back at him. The clouds were thicker now, and wind was strong. He picked up his bag and walked to the camp, hoping she would follow. She did not move at first, but then she stood, her legs weak and her steps slow. She limped toward him, one step at a time, like her body wanted to trust, but her heart was still afraid. When she reached the edge of his camp, she stopped and looked around like she had never seen fire or tents before. Jack lit the fire with old wood and a spark tool. The flames jumped to life, and the warmth spread fast. The girl stepped back, scared by the heat, but then moved closer again. Drawn by the light, he placed a blanket near the fire and stepped away, giving her room. She sat slowly, her arms wrapped around her knees and her eyes wide in the fire glow. He cooked a fish over the flame. The smell filled the air, and her stomach growled loud. Her face turned red, and she looked away ashamed. Jack tore a piece of fish and placed it near her on a clean rock. He did not speak, just waited. She stared at it for a long time, then picked it up and smelled it. Her hands trembled as she took the first bite. Her eyes closed, and a small sound left her lips, something soft like a thank you in her own way. Jack watched her, and for the first time he saw not just fear, but something else, a small light in her eyes. Maybe the first step to trust, maybe something more there. Wind howled outside, but inside the camp, the fire burned bright, and the night stayed quiet. The fire crackled and gave off soft light that danced on the alien girl's face. Her silver skin glowed in the warmth, and her eyes followed every flicker like it was alive. She sat close, but not too close, her body tense, her shoulders tight, like she could run at any moment. Jack stayed silent, watching her carefully, not wanting to scare her again. He placed another fish over the fire, this one small and fresh, caught from the stream. Nearby, the smell filled the air, and her eyes moved to it fast. But she did not reach for it. Instead, she looked at Jack, then at the fish, then back at the fire. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her hands stayed in her lap, fingers curled tight. Jack broke the fish in half and slid one piece across the smooth stone between them. He leaned back, showing her it was hers to take. She blinked once, then twice, then slowly stretched her arm forward. Her fingers touched the food and pulled it back quick, like she feared he would stop her, but Jack did nothing, just nodded once and watched her eat the taste. Made her pause, then her eyes closed, and she took another bite slower, this time as if she could not believe it was real. Her body relaxed just a little, her breathing softer now, but the fear still sat in her eyes like a shadow that would not leave. Jack poured water into a metal cup and set it beside her. She looked at it for a long time, then reached out and took it both hands, holding it like it was something rare. She drank, with small sips, and then looked at Jack. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but she only nodded slightly. Her first small sign of thanks. Night grew darker, and the wind outside made the tent flap gently. The forest around them was full of strange sounds, clicks, and hums and rustles that never came from Earth animals. Thea, the alien girl, flinched at one deep hum, and looked around fast, her hands grabbing the edge of the blanket like a shield. Jack followed her eyes, and saw nothing but trees and fog. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small glowing stone. It was a signal beacon, broken now, but still warm. It gave soft blue light. He placed it near her, and said the word safe, then pointed to her, then to the light again, and said safe. She watched his hands, then looked at the stone. Her fingers touched it slowly, and she gave a soft sound, like a breath of relief. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders tighter, her eyes now on the fire again, her body still tense, but no longer shaking. Back against a log, and looked at the stars above the tent, opened at the top to let smoke out the sky. Here was full of purple clouds and green sparks like falling stars that never landed. It was beautiful but cold and strange, nothing like Earth, nothing like home. He glanced at Thea, and saw her staring at him, her eyes narrow, her face full of questions. He smiled just a little, and tapped his chest. Jack then pointed to her. She hesitated, then whispered Thea, her voice soft like wind in leaves. He repeated it softly, Thea, and she looked down, her face unreadable. Jack wanted to ask her so much, but words were no use now, so he stayed quiet, and let the fire talk for Thea. Loud snap echoed through the trees, and Thea jumped, her eyes wide, her hands grabbing a small rock from the ground. She crouched like an animal ready to run. Jack stood slow, and grabbed his flare gun, his eyes scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the sound had been real. Not wind, not animal, something big. He held his finger to his lips, and Thea nodded once, still holding the rock, her body low to the ground. Jack stepped outside the tent. The night was colder than before, and the fog thick. He moved toward the trees, but found nothing, just broken branches, like something had passed through. He walked back slowly, and saw Thea still in the same spot, waiting, not moving, until he gave a short wave. Then she relaxed a little, not much, just enough to breathe again. Sat again near the fire, the silence now deeper than before. Her eyes stayed on the trees, but she no longer looked like she would scream. Jack added more wood to the flames. The light grew stronger, and pushed the dark back a little. Thea lay down with the blanket still wrapped tight around her, her eyes still open, watching the fire. Her lips moved again, this time whispering something soft and strange. It sounded like a song, but Jack could not understand. He lay down to placing his pack under his head, and keeping the flare gun close, his eyes on the roof of the tent, where smoke curled up into the sky, his mind full of questions about who she was, where she came from, and who might be looking for her. Thea closed her eyes for just a moment, and Jack noticed the tears slipping down her cheek, silent and slow, like she had cried too much before to fight it now. He wanted to speak, wanted to say she was safe, but the words felt small and useless in this wild place. So he did what he could. He stayed near, kept the fire alive, and watched the dark for anything that might come closer. Morning light slipped through the trees like golden smoke, and the fire was just glowing ash. Now the forest was quiet, but the air still felt heavy, like something had passed through and left its mark. Jack sat near the cold pit with a small stick in his hand, drawing lines in the dirt, simple shapes, circles, lines, arrows, a sun with rays. He spoke as he drew, his voice soft and slow. Jack. Thea watched him from across the tent, her knees pulled close, and the blanket still around her shoulders. Her eyes moved from his face to the shapes, then back again. He tapped his chest once. Jack then pointed to the figure in the dirt, the stickman he had drawn. She tilted her head, not speaking. Then her hand moved. She touched the dirt and drew her own shape beside his. Hers had strange marks on the arms, curved like vines. Her voice whispered a single word. Thea. Her fingers trembled, but she kept her eyes on the drawing. Jack smiled, not wide, not big, just enough to show he was trying. He pointed at the sky, then made a circle in the dirt, then a small stick figure with 2 lines for wings. He said the word ship, then shook his head and crossed it out, meaning broken, gone, no ship, no. Thea watched closely, her fingers moving as she drew another shape a tall tower, and small dots around it. She pointed to the dots, then to herself, then to the far woods. Her face serious, her eyes dark. Jack leaned in. He understood she had come from somewhere far, not alone. Not safe, she had escaped something. Or someone. He drew a tree, then a fish, then fire, pointing to each, and saying the words. Tree, fish, fire. She listened and repeated softly, not perfect, but close. Her voice was gentle. Careful, like every sound might be wrong, but she kept trying, and he kept teaching. By noon, they had 10 words between them, and 3 hand signs for yes, no, and danger. They used sticks, stones, and their hands to build meaning between their worlds. It was slow, but it worked, and every new word felt like a step out of fear into something better. Jack gave her a new shirt from his pack. One too big but warm. She touched the fabric like it was treasure, then slipped it on under her torn robe. She stood up slowly, her limp still there, but better than before. He offered her a walking stick, and she took it with both hands, nodding once. In thanks they walked together to the stream. The path. Rough but quiet birds flew over them with long tails and glassy wings. The water was cold and clear. Thea bent to drink. Her hands cupped tight. Jack caught a fish with a wire trap and held it up. She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her, her teeth small and sharp, but her eyes soft, like the edge of night. They walked back. She pointed to the ground and said, foot, then touched her leg and said pain. Jack nodded and gave her a herb from his pouch. She smelled it, then chewed the leaf and winced at the taste, but swallowed anyway. He drew a heart in the dirt and said strong, then pointed to her. She looked confused at first, then touched her chest and said, Theath. At night, the fire burned bright again, and the stars above were sharp and blue, like eyes watching from space. Thea sat closer now, not touching but near enough that Jack felt her warmth. She drew shapes in the dirt as she spoke slowly, her hands moving like waves. She showed him a large circle, then pointed to the sky, then a smaller one, then touched her own head. He guessed she was from a world near a bigger one, maybe a moon or a small planet orbiting something else. He tried to draw the system, but she laughed, a short sound that made the night feel light. She took the stick from him and corrected his drawing, her hand sure and quick. Then her face changed. Her hand drew a mark on her arm, not real, just in the dirt, a scar like the one behind her ear. She pointed to it, then to the sky, then made her hands into claws. Jack understood. Someone had taken her, someone had hurt her, and now they were searching. He looked at the trees and listened hard. No sound, just wind, but something in him knew they were not alone. The way the birds flew away fast, the way the night fell too quiet, it all spoke danger without words. They picked up a small stone and handed it to Jack. It was smooth and blue with strange marks. He turned it over and over, then looked at her. Her eyes held something like fear, but also trust. She pointed to the stone, then to herself, then to him. She was giving it to him, as a sign, as a promise, maybe even a bond. He nodded and placed the stone in his coat near his heart, then touched her shoulder gently. Her body stiffened for a second, then relaxed. The fire popped, and she looked into it, her face lit orange and gold. They spoke no more that night, but their silence was not empty. It was full of things they had said, without words, and the slow rhythm of two souls learning how to speak without fear. Asterisk. The night came faster than before, and the stars were hidden behind thick clouds that moved like dark smoke above the trees. The fire in the camp still burned, but the warmth did little to stop the cold that crept through the ground. Jack sat near the flames, sharpening a long metal rod with a stone, while Thea crouched on the other side, wrapping the blanket tight around her shoulders. Her eyes kept going to the forest, her ears twitching at every sound. There was something different tonight. The air felt heavy and strange. The wind no longer danced through the leaves, it whispered low and slow, like a warning. Jack stood and looked beyond the trees, trying to see what her sharp senses already knew. Something was out there, something not of the forestier. Pointed to the sky, then made a wide circle with her hands, then touched her head and crossed her arms. Jack did not understand at first, then she repeated it, slower, more firm than he saw it. She was saying they are coming, the ones who marked her, the ones who chased her. He grabbed the flare gun and moved to the edge of the camp, his eyes sweeping the shadows. Nothing moved, but the forest no longer sounded like life. No birds, no bugs, just silence and cold. Suddenly, a soft click echoed through the trees, and Thea gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she ducked low behind a rock. Jack turned fast, pointing the flare gun toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. A shape moved near the trees, slow and careful, like a hunter stalking prey. It had no glow, no sound, just heavy steps on wet leaves. Jack held his breath and watched it pass, a tall figure with silver armor and long arms. Something hung from its back, something sharp and long. The thing paused just outside the light of the fire, sniffing the air like a beast, then moved on, slow and silent. Thea did not move, her eyes locked on it, Body frozen like stone, Jack lowered the flare gun and waited until the sound faded into nothing. He turned to her and spoke low. Danger, close, hide. She nodded and crawled into the tent, pulling the blanket over her head. Jack kicked dirt over the fire, killing the light. Smoke rose into the air, thick and dark. They sat in the dark now, only the red glow of ash between them. Jack kept his hand on the flare gun and his eyes on the trees. Thea's breath was fast and quiet, but her body stayed low, and still another sound came, this time from behind them, soft but steady. The click of metal touching stone. Jack turned slow, trying not to make noise, but his foot pressed on a twig, and it snapped. The sound stopped, and then moved again, faster now to them. Jack raised the flare gun, but held fire. He could not risk drawing more of them, if there were more. Thea touched his arm, and shook her head, then pointed down and made a sign for wait. Jack nodded and lowered his arm just as a second figure stepped into the clearing, this one smaller, but with the same armor, same slow steps, same cold presence. It scanned the camp, and raised a hand. A light beam shot out from its wrist, and scanned the fire pit, the rocks. The Jack's skin went cold. The beam stopped just short of Thea's hiding spot. The figure tilted its head, then moved away into the dark, following the first one. They waited still and silent, long after the sounds were gone, the fire long dead, and the cold deep in their bones. Only when a bird sang far away did Thea lift her head, her eyes wide and wet with fear. Jack stood and reached for a small pack, pulling out a cloth and placing it on the ground. He began packing fast: food, water, tools, maps. Thea watched him, then slowly stood, her body stiff from hiding. She walked to him and touched his shoulder, then pointed at her ear and showed him a mark behind it, a small red scar. Jack looked close and saw a metal piece just under her skin, a tracker, something that called them to her. He grabbed his knife and showed it to her, then pointed at the scar, then shook his head. Her eyes filled with fear, and she nodded. They could not run while it was still inside her. She sat down and bit her lip as Jack cleaned the blade, then lit a small fire again, just enough for light. Her hands gripped the dirt, and her face turned pale. He knelt beside her and gently pressed the knife to her skin. She shook once, then went still. He cut slow, careful, sweat on his forehead as he dug around the metal. At last it popped free, and he tossed it into the fire. It sparked and hissed and burned. Thea gasped and leaned against him, her body shaking, but her eyes full of relief. Jack wrapped a cloth around the wound, then gave her water. She drank with shaking hands, but gave him a small nod. They sat in silence again, the fire low and weak, but enough to see the truth. They were not safe, not anymore. They had to move before the hunters returned. Jack pointed to the map and traced a line through the woods to an old crash site, a place with human tech, maybe still working, maybe not, but better than waiting to die. Thea nodded and placed her hand over his, then took the smooth blue stone from her pocket and gave it back to him, her eyes steady, her voice clear. Thea, go with Jack. The morning came slow and gray, with no sunlight, only a pale sky full of clouds that moved like quiet smoke. The forest was still and cold, and every shadow looked like it could hold danger. Jack sat beside the low fire, map in hand, and eyes scanning the trees. Thea sat close now, the blanket around her shoulders and the wound on her neck wrapped with clean cloth. Her face was pale but calm, and her hands rested on her lap, holding the blue stone tight. She leaned forward and tapped the map, then pointed to a symbol near the edge of the marked valley, a symbol shaped like an eye with 3 lines through it. Jack looked at her, then nodded. That was the crash site, an old human ship, long dead, but maybe still holding power tools. Answers, maybe. Thea drew another mark in the dirt beside the map, a circle with jagged edges, then pointed to her shoulder and showed the brand there. Jack leaned closer and stared. The mark in the dirt matched the one on her skin. Her fingers moved again, drawing a triangle with 2 dots inside it. Then she tapped the trees around them and held up 2 fingers. Jack understood now. 2 hunters, maybe more, watching from the woods, and marked with the same symbol. Her brand was not just a scar, it was a target, a beacon, something that tied her to a larger system of control. And Painhai stood and gathered the last of their gear, a rope, a flare gun, a knife, some dried meat, and the small tracker piece. Now black from the fire, he wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into his coat. Maybe they could use it later to trick the ones chasing them. Thea stood slowly, her legs still weak but stronger than before. She picked up a sharp stick and tied a small stone to one end, a simple spear, but better than nothing. She looked at Jack, then at the trees, and gave a single nod. Ready. They moved fast and quiet through the forest, staying low and off the path. Birds flew above, and strange shapes moved in the distance, but nothing came close. They crossed 2 streams and a broken bridge, then climbed a small ridge that overlooked the valley below there. It was the crash site, a large metal shape, half buried in the earth. smoke still rising from broken vents and lights blinking in slow patterns. Jack stared in silence. Thea stepped beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Thea climbed down using ropes and roots to reach the lower ground. The air smelled like burned wires and old fuel. Jack found a side door, pried it open, and stepped inside. Thea followed her spear, ready, her eyes sharp. The inside of the ship was dark and filled with dust, metal walls scratched and wires hanging from the ceiling. Jack turned on a small light and led the way to the command room. Screens flickered with weak power and a soft hum filled the air. Thea touched one screen, and it lit up brighter, her skin glowing faint blue in the dark. Jack stared as the ship responded to her presence, opening doors and clearing data logs. She was not just anyone, she was someone important, someone tied to this technology. They found a medical station and Jack cleaned her wound again, replaced the cloth and gave her water. She smiled, small and tired, but relay loud crash echoed outside, metal on stone, and both of them froze. Jack moved to the window and saw two figures entering the valley. The hunters had followed them faster than expected. He pulled out the old tracker piece and looked at Thea, then pointed to the back of the ship. She nodded and led him through narrow halls into a cargo bay filled with boxes and broken machines. They placed the tracker under a heavy crate near the door, then climbed into a hidden vent above the room. Jack pulled the grate shut, and they waited, breath held, hearts pounding. The hunters entered, moving slow, their eyes glowing red as they scanned the room. One stepped close to the tracker, then paused, tilting its head. The other moved to the crate and kicked it over, revealing the dead device. A long hiss came from both as they turned and left, searching the wrong direction. Jack exhaled and looked at Thea. She gave a small grin and touched his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold. They waited another hour, then climbed down and left the ship, heading east toward the mountains where human tech was stronger, and maybe a rescue signal still lived. As they walked, Thea began to speak, more using broken words. Mixed with signs, she told him of her home. A city in the sky full of light and glass, where her people lived in peace until the dark ships came and took the young, marked them, trained them, used them. She had escaped during a storm, crashed here, alone, hunted since that day, and then found by him in the forest. Jack listened in silence, his hand on the blue stone she had given him, now hanging around his neck like a charm. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, lighting the path ahead. The trees opened to a wide field, and beyond that, the edge of the mountains. Thea stopped and looked back once, her eyes on the trees behind them, then forward to the peaks that waited. They walked together without speaking. Now their steps steady, their bond silent and strong. They had no army, no weapons, no plan, but they had each other and the will to survive. On somewhere in the stars, others would come looking for what had escaped them, but they would not find fear. They would find fire. Asterisk. The mountain path was steep and rough, with sharp stones and thin air. The trees became fewer, and the wind colder. Jack moved ahead, carving steps into the frozen soil, while Thea followed close behind, her breath heavy, her eyes wide as she looked around at the strange shapes the cliffs formed around them. Their shadows, long like fingers, reaching for the sky. She slipped once and Jack caught her, his hand gripping hers, strong and warm. She looked at him, and for a second her fear faded, not because the danger was gone, but because she was not alone anymore. Jack gave a small nod, then pulled her up, and they kept walking, the snow crunching under their feet, the only sound between them. They reached a ridge that looked over a valley, and there they saw it, old stone towers buried in ice, broken statues of strange creatures, and symbols carved into walls taller than trees. Thea gasped, her hands touching her lips, her eyes full of memory. She ran forward, and Jack followed her into the ruins. Their air changed around them, heavy and warm despite the cold. Above, a soft glow came from the stones. As they walked deeper, Thea touched one wall, and it lit up, lines of blue light racing like veins across the stone. The place was not dead, it was asleep, waiting, and now it was awake. Jack watched in silence as Thea walked to the center of the temple, her steps slow like a dream, her body glowing with soft blue light, her eyes closed, and her lips moving in whispers he could not understand. Then a circle of light rose around her, and the air hummed with sound and power. She opened her eyes and spoke one word in his language. Safe. Jack stepped forward, but the light stopped him. He reached out, and it warmed his fingers. Not fire, not ice, but something deeper, something that made him feel seen and known. Then the light faded, and Thea fell to her knees, breathing hard, her hands shaking. Jack ran to her and lifted her gently. Her skin was hot, and her eyes wet with tears, but she smiled and whispered something soft he could not hear. They stayed there for hours, resting inside the warm glow of the ancient place. Jack explored the rooms and found tools. Old but useful blades made of crystal lights, powered by touch maps, showing stars he had never seen. Thea sat near a pool of still water, her reflection shimmering Like a memory, her fingers moving across the surface, drawing shapes and symbols. Jack sat beside her and she looked at him, her voice calm and slow. She told him stories of her people, of the old ways of temples like this built before the stars, had names of how her kind once walked the galaxies, not as soldiers but as singers and healers. Then the dark ships came, and the songs were lost. Jack listened, every word like a heartbeat in his chest. He did not understand all of it, but he felt the truth in her voice. The sorrow, the strength, the hope. That night they lit a fire inside the temple, its flames small and soft. Thea sat close to Jack, her body leaning into his, her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her. And they said nothing, only breathed together. In the silence then came the sound, not loud but deep, a low hum like a machine waking from sleep. Jack stood and looked outside. The sky was full of shadows. Dark ships moving across the stars, lights scanning the ground, slow and cold. Thea stood beside him, her eyes fierce no more, fear only fire. She turned back into the temple and placed her hands on the wall. The stones lit again, brighter this time. The ground shaking as old doors opened, and a machine stepped out, tall and silver, with eyes that glowed like hers. It knelt before her, and she touched its head, whispering words Jack could not understand. Then she turned to him and smiled, a warrior's smile full of power and peace. The machine gave Jack a shield shaped like a star, and a blade light as air. Thea wore a new robe taken from the temple, blue and white, with her mark glowing gold on her chest. She looked like the stories she had told, a queen, a guardian, a survivor. They walked outside together into the cold wind, and waited as the ships came closer. Jack held his shield tight, and looked at Thea. She nodded once, and he knew they would not run, not now, not ever. The temple behind them glowed brighter, and the sky began to hum. The ships stopped, unsure, as if they felt something new, something strong, something human, and something. Marethia stepped forward and raised her hand. The wind answered, and the ground shook. The machine behind her moved with speed and light. Jack followed, shield raised, heart steady. They were not soldiers, not killers, not monsters. They were two souls, bound by fear, turned to fire by trust, and ready to stand together. The ships circled above their shadows, crawling over the snow as the cold wind howled through the mountains. The light from the ancient temple still glowed behind Jack and Thea, casting long beams across the frozen stone. The machine guardian stood tall, its arms folded, its metal skin shining like starlight. Thea held her new spear close, the crystal tip pulsing with energy, her face calm, her body steady, her fear long gone. Jack stood beside her, shield raised, blade ready, his eyes on the sky. His breath slow and even. He remembered when she had first fallen into his trap, broken and afraid, her eyes wide with terror, her hands shaking at every sound. Now she stood like a queen, unshaken by the death that flew above them. One of the ships dropped low, dust and snow kicking up around it, legs extended and metal claws scraping the ground. Its door opened, and 3 hunters stepped out, tall and armored, their helmets smoothed, their weapons glowing. They moved without sound, spreading into a wide line there, red eyes locked on the temple. Thea stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear in her own tongue. The air around her shimmered with each word. The hunters paused, then raised their weapons, as if her words meant nothing, as if she were still just prey. Jack moved to her side, not behind, not ahead, but beside her. The machine stepped forward, and the ground shook with each step. Its chest opened, and fired a beam of light into the air, not at the hunters, not at the ship, but into the clouds above. A signal, ancient and deep, calling something older than all of them. The hunters fired their beams fast and bright, but the shield on Jack's arm flared to life, stopping the blasts with bursts of blue light. Thea spun her spear through the air and sent a wave of force that knocked one hunter to the ground. The machine charged forward and grabbed the second, smashing its weapon before it could aim again. Jack leapt at the third, driving his blade into the chest plate. The armor cracked, and the hunter fell back, sparks flying from its joints. The snow turned dark where it landed, steam rising as its systems failed. More ships came, now 5, then 10, dark shapes falling like rain, but the signal had already reached its mark. The clouds above turned gold, and a ring of light opened in the sky. Something massive moved behind it, something with wings made of stars, and a voice that sang without sound. The hunters froze, their red eyes dimming, their weapons lowering. They stepped back, confused, unready for the force that now rose against them. Thea raised her hands, and the temple answered, a dome of light expanding across the mountain, forcing the enemy ships to halt in mid. Jack stood at her side and felt the warmth of her energy, not fire, not heat, but something like the heart of a living star. It flowed through him, filled him, made his steps firm in his strikes, strong. The machine moved with them, its arms like walls, its voice humming like thunder beneath it. Snow. The hunters retreated into their ship, but it could not rise. The light above held it still, then crushed it flat like paper caught in a storm. The other ships turned and vanished into the clouds, afraid now, no longer the hunters, no longer the master. Silence fell once more, only wind and light and breath. Jack turned to Tharia and saw her looking up, her eyes wet, not from fear but from peace. She turned to him and smiled, then touched his chest, her fingers resting over his heart. "You saved me," she whispered, "not with traps, not with weapons, but with kindness." Jack smiled back, his words slow and soft. "You saved me too." They stood at the edge of the world, their bodies tired, their hearts full behind them. The temple faded into stone, the machine stepped back into shadow, its task done, its light dimming. Thea took Jack's hand, and together they walked down the path back into the forest, where green would grow again, where the sound of birds would return, where peace was no longer a dream. She no longer feared him, and he no longer feared the world. They had faced the dark and did not fall. They had stood together and did not break. The bond between them, made not by blood or war, but by a trap that became a fire, and fear that became strength, would carry across stars and into stories yet to be born. The stars watched as they walked, and the wind carried their Namastoc Theato souls who met by mistake and changed a world.